So I'm always excited to come to Chicago. It's one of my favorite American cities, despite its politics. Partly because it gave us Calvin Coolidge in the 1920. There's this question about whether or not Coolidge would actually become president or get the nomination in 1920, and that convention was held here in Chicago. It also gave me the subject of my next book, Barack Obama, who it's very fascinating to me that we went from, and essentially my grandparents' lifetime, we went from Calvin Coolidge to Barack Obama. And I'm fairly young, so I hesitate to think what it will be like in maybe 80 years, 90 years later, whether we'll degenerate or whether we'll restore ourselves. Now, Coolidge is interesting for my purposes. I come from a family of political leftists, even though I'm obviously on the right. And in my family, it was always an insult to say the Republicans are trying to go back to the time of Calvin Coolidge. My grandfather, who at one point was actually a member of the Socialist Party in Massachusetts, would always talk about how terrible Calvin Coolidge was. So as a joke, my grandmother, as a Christmas present, gave me a copy of Coolidge's speeches when I was around 10, 11, 12 years old. And I actually read them, found them kind of interesting. So be careful what kind of books you give to your children and grandchildren. Now, Coolidge is also interesting because there's so little that's actually known about it, even by people who are on the political right. One of my arguments in the book is that for those of us trying to restore American greatness or the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we've had this Tea Party. Tea Party has lost some steam. Partly because of the big government Republicans, within the country. That was an issue that Coolidge was dealing with as well. So many of these issues seem to keep repeating themselves. Issues of immigration, questions of civil rights, issues of whether our foreign policy is wandering aimlessly. All these kind of questions were things that that Coolidge was dealing with as well. And so what's interesting about Coolidge is, despite how little is known about him, he actually left quite a paper trail. He's sort of the only good career public servant. I mean, he ran for office 20 times, was elected 19 of them. His only race he ever lost was for school board, which is something Hasmin can relate to, maybe. But what's interesting about him is that most Americans only know two things about our 30th president, neither of which is actually true. That he got the name Silent Cal for being so quiet, and that when he spoke at all, he was a mouthpiece for industry, peddling bromides such as the business of America is business, as if that would be a bad thing. But this cartoonish portrayal is lodged in the popular imagination largely because New Deal historians wanted to downplay Coolidge's popularity and to write his successes out of the history books. We actually saw some of this with Ronald Reagan. It's only in recent years that a lot of historians have actually come to appreciate what Reagan actually did. They tried to make him into this dunce. There was a Saturday Night Live sort of thing, caricaturizing him. And they did that very successfully with Calvin Coolidge. The real Coolidge, though, wasn't very silent. He was a practical joker who could be downright chatty. And far from worshiping at the altar of business, Coolidge, one of our most religious presidents, was also a very serious thinker. The man from Vermont, as he was known, he eschewed luxury and he condemned it, saying that prosperity wasn't the goal of society, but rather a happy result of a well-functioning society. So he didn't think that we should just, give business everything. He was against sort of the corporatists of his day. He loved the free enterprise system, and he knew that businessmen aren't always its greatest friend. And perhaps as a cautionary tale about the excesses of the Roaring Twenties, which he presided over, he warned that there is no surer road to destruction than prosperity without character. And one of the interesting things is that I would love to go back to a time of economic growth in the 1920s. Every American got effectively, in the 6-year period of Coolidge's presidency, about a 40% raise, which would be really, I'm sure we could all enjoy that. And what was interesting about it is that the left characterized this time. I mean, you see The Great Gatsby. There's sort of this orgy of spending, this kind of excess. What was interesting about that period is that literacy rates increased. Many Americans went to college for the first time. Women were educated in families for the first time. Blacks had, renewed civil rights. All these things were a product of a growing economy. And Coolidge understood that, the reason we have money is to also better ourselves, not just to spend it on excess. It's my contention that only by understanding Coolidge as he understood himself and the politics of the day can we hope to learn what he has to teach about American life, the economy, and the Constitution. He earned the Silent Cal nickname because of his reticence at parties. He didn't like to glad hand people. He wasn't the sort to throw these elaborate, sort of parties that we've kind of known in Washington now. Certainly there would be no $200 million safari trips for him. But in his public life, Coolidge published 3 collections of speeches, an autobiography, hundreds of letters, and a syndicated post-presidential column that made him the George Will of his day. He gave them more than 500 press conferences during his 5.5 years as president, but he was careful to mind what he had to say. And what's interesting about this kind of Coolidge's ideas is that he had a very close relationship with the press. I mean, of course, the press was very different then as it is now, but his attitude was that I'm not going to be, giving these massive speeches. You're going to come into my office and you're going to quote me as an administration official, because that's what I am, not as Calvin Coolidge, and I'm going to tell you what we're doing, and you can, criticize me or whatever in this office, but this is the relationship he built with the press. And they liked this level of access, and so they continued it. And so many of the things that for a long time we thought were just an anonymous administration official, in fact, many of the anti-Coolidge books that were criticizing this anonymous administration official were actually criticizing Coolidge, just they weren't knowing it. Now this is interesting because, as Coolidge put it, the words of a president have an enormous weight and ought not be used indiscriminately. He didn't believe in giving speeches just for the sake of giving speeches, which is something I think current politicians could learn. So Coolidge was enormously popular in his day. He was in fact, if you look at kind of the equivalent of exit polling in the day, he was far and away one of the most popular political figures of his time. So it's interesting today that, of course, he's always ranked in kind of the low rankings as one of the great American presidents. We know that a young Ronald Reagan listened to him on the radio and developed a lifelong fascination. And what's interesting here is, so I went to the Reagan Library. My next essay, I think for the Claremont Review Books, will be on Reagan's Coolidge. Reagan mentioned Coolidge 270 times, which is more than any other figure. And you can actually go and see in Reagan's hand at the Reagan Library in California, where speechwriters are trying to take out Reagan, and he's like, no, put them back in, put him back in. And so they'll even quote him wrong, and he will correct them from memory of the Coolidge quotation, which is a very different kind of approach to speechwriting than we've seen. One of the more popular biographers of the time, William Allen White, who wrote an actually fair account of Coolidge, said that there's something about Coolidge which few people understood. Why is he so popular? Why is he so successful? And so this is something he was wondering. When a man has gone into 20 elections and has won 19, he has something in him which compels confidence and which represents the popular will. And a lesson contemporary conservatives would do well to learn, Coolidge understood that republics are made of public opinion, and so ever the statesman he set out to shape it. He spoke to issues very similar to our own. One of the ones, we could talk about one of the good things about Coolidge is that there's so little written about him, so you can actually read every book on Coolidge, which is what I did. There's only like 20 of them, so you can actually go and educate yourself about him. One of the issues that I was particularly interested in, particularly with Illinois, and some of the other states like my state of California or Massachusetts, sort of the relationship with government unions, which he considered to be an impossibility. His view was that that it's essentially a conflict of interest. You can't swear loyalty to the public on the one hand and also to a union on the other. It would be as if we had soldiers that unionized. I mean, it would be an impossibility. And I think we saw that this past week with Oakland, where the cops essentially walked off the job while people were rioting. So in the Boston police strike of 1919, which actually brought Coolidge to the popular imagination and which made him a national figure, the then Governor Coolidge dealt a major blow to public employee union excesses. And we can get into this kind of more if you want to talk about it, but what he did was so the communists, this is not often told in history books, but the communists and the anarchists were essentially trying to take over labor unions and cause labor strife in this country. In Seattle, they took over they took over the entire city. There was all these protests, there were a number of bombings, and Coolidge is sort of the first national figure to say enough. And so he called in the state guard to restore order in Boston after all the police officers walked off the job, and there was effectively anarchy in the streets. In fact, the same place that some of the National Guard or the State Guard walked down was Tremont Street, where the Boston bombing was fairly recently. So it's kind of an interesting historical parallel. What's also interesting about Coolidge is that those of us who are on the political right often find ourselves having to deny the impossible, that that we're not racists, or that we are we're always attacked for having a history as a political party that's somehow not in defense of civil rights. And some of us go back to Lincoln, but we can actually go back to Coolidge, because throughout his time in government, he worked to bring in new immigrant groups, Jews, women, blacks, Native Americans. These were all groups that actually supported Coolidge. And in fact, the first person in Illinois to actually nominate Coolidge to run for president in his own right was the first woman to ever nominate somebody at a national convention. And this is all, I think this is all part because they understood that the Coolidge prosperity was about making all these different groups into citizens. Now, what I'm kind of most interested in Coolidge is his political philosophy, particularly his idea of economic freedom and his view of the Declaration of Independence. And for Coolidge, all of this tremendous economic prosperity, all people getting cars for the first time, radios, rolling off the assembly lines, this was all possible because he understood the chief meaning of freedom, which is, as he put it, the right of the individual to possess, enjoy, and control the dollar which he earns. Quote, liberty would be a mockery unless it secured to the individual the rewards of his own effort and industry. So this is not somebody who wants to spread the wealth around. And he hated class welfare because, as he put it, Americans believe in prosperity. It is absurd to suppose that Americans are envious of those who are already prosperous. The wise and correct course was not to destroy those who have already secured success, but to create conditions under which everyone will have a better chance to be successful. Many of his thinking, I think, would be tailor-made for today's conservative activists. He understood the importance of education, which of course is something that the Heartland Institute champions. And he also understood the importance of patriotism, of what it actually means to be a serious patriot. And so he put it this way: patriotism is easy to understand in America. It means looking out for yourself by looking out for your country. In no other nation on earth does this principle have such complete application. And then when it came to the American Constitution, there is no dignity quite so impressive, no independence quite so important as living within your means. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race. Quite a difference from today. So my book, Why Coolidge Matters, is intended to faithfully report what Coolidge had to say in the hope that we might restore his views about limited government, American independence, and constitutionalism in those speeches. His thinking on immigration, on civil rights, on foreign policy, on government unions, and especially what it actually means to be liberally educated. Those are all things that require careful attention by politicians today. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who think of Coolidge as a libertarian president. And this is always difficult to kind of get into because I know Amity Schleye's book is out. Many of you have read it. I've read it. I disagree with Amity on some points. A lot of it, I think the book is fantastic. I think you should go out and read that book as well if you're interested in Coolidge. But one of the interesting points about Coolidge is that while libertarians often champion small government, Coolidge very much believed in limited government. And they're not always the same thing. And what I mean by that is that there are certain powers that the government has that we would want them to have. I mean, we would want them to, if there was a threat of us being invaded, we wouldn't necessarily want a small army to protect us. We'd want to actually just protect the country. Oftentimes we overdo it, and this was something that Coolidge understood. He also, he thought that the Washington bureaucracy and all those sorts of things should be much smaller than they are. Vetoed a number of bills to actually expand it. But he also believed in things like the protective tariff, which is not exactly the most libertarian idea around. So what's interesting about him is that on the one hand he had these libertarian instincts, and on the other hand he also had ideas that those of us on the right would reject today. And a lot of that comes from his understanding of the Declaration of Independence and his understanding of religion. And it's kind of hard because he's the last president to actually pay down the national debt, which is very depressing. But he's also the last he's the last president to pay down the national debt. He decreased taxes from 70% down to the low 20s. So he did a number of things that we would regard as good things, but he was also a very religious president who thought that faith should be taught in public schools, the Bible should be taught in public schools, things that I happen to agree with, but are not often very politically correct today. He did not think a republic was actually even possible without moral and religious education. and he believed that Holy Writ's command that you shall know the truth and it shall set you free, which is one of his favorite Bible verses, ought to be the guiding principle in education and in our republic. He quoted scripture often. So what's interesting about Coolidge, there's sort of a lot more here, but the most important thing to understand from his political philosophy is the centrality of the Declaration of Independence. Many of you have probably read the speech he gave on the sesquicentennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 5th, 1926, where he explains why the Declaration of Independence is so important. And for him, the Declaration comes from both religious and political places. And that is something we've kind of lost today. And he reasoned that as we have sort of a common Father in God the Father, that we therefore are all brothers, in self-government, and so I can't rule Jim and Jim can't rule me except by consent. And that was sort of the basic principle of his politics. And he applied these, this idea that man should behave as Christ did, as a servant and not a master, was something that he quoted, he spoke about often. And that idea was a very powerful one at the time because it meant that certain things like racism, like eugenics, like the Klan, these things could all be defeated. And these are things that Coolidge actually did. I mean, I go into some length in the book about how he fought the Klan at the same time, censoring a pro-Klan film in Boston, which was sparking a riot, at the same time that Woodrow Wilson was having the maker of that pro-Klan film into the White House. At the same time, Woodrow Wilson, who of course Barack Obama has quoted and is fond of, at the same time that he was resegregating Washington D.C., Coolidge was bringing blacks into his government, one of the first Massachusetts governors to actually do so. And what's interesting is that in 1924, Coolidge makes all Native Americans in the country citizens, not just those who'd left reservations. And what's interesting is that while he's signing this bill, he actually goes several days later and joins several Indian tribes. And the thinking is that if I can join their tribe, or they can join our tribe, I should be able to join their tribe. And so there's a famous picture of him in Indian headdress, which is, maybe some of you have seen. This is the same kind of thinking. And he also thought, what's interesting is, there's a debate right now going on in immigration about what should be done. And Coolidge he wanted to restrict the number of immigrants coming in from countries that he thought disliked us. So, for instance, there had been a series of bombings. Many of them were planned by anarchists from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And rightly, I think he thought that if we banned a lot of those immigrants from coming into the United States, or had restricted quotas for how they could come into the United States, that we would stop the bombing. And of course, that actually is what ended up happening. So there have been 200 bombings in the decade before Coolidge's presidency, and I think there were maybe 2 or 3 in the decade afterwards, which maybe we should think about when we settle Chechens. Just a thought. Of course, he also thought, which is some debate that we've lost today on immigrants, and I should say I'm not anti-immigrant. I actually just married one, so that he also thought that there are immigrants who are born in different, or there are Americans born in different countries, and the question is how do we make immigrants that settle here American, and went into some length at how you would do that you would educate them into what it means to be American, teach them the Declaration of Independence, teach them the Bible, because the idea is that if they belong to a sort of our common faith in sort of America writ large, you could actually become part of it. Now, what's interesting about Coolidge is that this Declaration of Independence principle, this idea of the natural equality of man, put him against some of sort of the establishment thinking of the day. I mean, the eugenicists, for instance, the social Darwinists who are teaching that they were applying Darwinism in a political context rather than an evolutionary context. Coolidge fought these people quite seriously, including many members of his own government and of the federal government who wanted to make the immigration quota about IQ. He said, you can't measure a man's worth by his intelligence. He also thought that, which was the survival of the fittest idea applied to politics, which Yale at the time, for instance, a lot of these famous Ivy League colleges were doing a lot of craniology studies, and they were doing all sorts of, looking at how people's physical bodies were and trying to assess, their inherent worth. And Coolidge was very critical of these ideas because, as he put it, it's not survival of the fittest, but sacrifice of the fittest. And the Titanic was the recent memory that everyone had, and he said, real men are the ones who give up their seats on on the to get on the lifeboat, they give it to the women and children. That's what separates us from the animals. Now, what I think is interesting is that it's something that's kind of lost in the political right today. And we should stress that Coolidge, despite being very religious, was not sectarian. Some of his finest speeches are actually given to Jewish audiences. He called the Jewish faith the faith of liberty. He applauded the Jewish connection to both the Declaration of Independence and the American founding, particularly when it came to there were a number of Jews, and we often forget this in our history books, but there were a number of Jews who signed the non-importation resolutions, or the stuff protesting the Stamp Act, and they were the people who were many of them bankrolled, like Chaim Solomon, for instance, bankrolled the American Revolution. We often think that sort of the Jewish contribution to American life began around the Ellis Island period, and Coolidge was very clear all throughout that Jews have always been here. They're a part of the American experience, and they should be part of government. So he's very against discrimination against Jews. He was also very against discrimination against Catholics. In fact, this non-drinking Protestant owes his entire political career to hanging out in bars in Northampton, Massachusetts, going and getting Irish Catholics who were largely Democrats to vote for him. And so there are some very funny speeches where he gives where everyone's clearly drunk in his early political career. And so he got the Catholic vote long before they were sort of Reagan Democrats. They were Coolidge Democrats, which is something that Reagan I think knew well. But what's interesting is that Coolidge thought that there's sort of this spiritual nature to man, and that really good politicians speak to this spiritual nature. And I think to a certain extent Barack Obama did that as well, although I think his was sort of a fake variety, the sort of idea of just change for the sake of change. But for Coolidge, that spiritual nature is something that you should appeal to even in times of despair. So as he put it, touch that spiritual nature and it will respond as the magnet responds to the pole. And as he put it, the most spiritual document in America is the Declaration of Independence. And Coolidge, owing to his belief in divine intervention, used highly religious language when discussing it. In his eyes, the document was, quote, a miracle, inspiring a, quote, reverence that helped bring pilgrims, again his words, of every nation to American shores. People at home and abroad alike, Coolidge said, considered Independence Hall hallowed ground and revered the Liberty Bell as a sacred relic. My favorite speech that Coolidge gives on the Declaration is actually one that he gave at the home of Daniel Webster, who was a very famous political thinker in Massachusetts as well as nationally. And Coolidge gave this speech about the Declaration of Independence, which I think I'll close because there may be a lot of questions about Coolidge we can get into. But this speech was delivered at the home of Daniel Webster on July 4th, 1916, and it's on the importance of what he thought the Declaration of Independence would be for the whole world. And his view was not that we should go and invade countries and democratize them. He was very reluctant to use the military, but his view is that if we run our own self-government very well, other countries will want to copy it because they'll see how strong we are and how much we have to offer the world, which is a bit of a different assessment than some people have today. So in any event, this is the speech. The Declaration of Independence was not so much a struggle of the colonies against the tyranny of bad government as against wrong principles of government and for self-government. It was man realizing himself. That realization persisted through time and touched all men's souls as it moved from Concord and Yorktown, marching on to Paris, to London, to Moscow, to Peking. Men of every clime respected the Declaration of Independence, for it marked the entry of new forces and new ideals into human affairs. This was, as Coolidge put it, the realization of the true glory and worth of man. Encouraged by that noble document, they had wrought vast changes that have marked all history since its day. And for Coolidge, I should just make this point, man's progress owed much to consideration of natural rights. But, this idea that we have certain rights that are in the nature, rather than ideas that positive rights as Barack Obama wants. But these were not sufficient to live by, that one had to kind of pledge oneself in one's sacred honor. And this is something that Coolidge understood and something that I think we need to understand today as we retake the country. And with that, I'll take some questions. So, yes, sir. And you should feel free to ask anything Coolidge related. It's been, my wife said I've been a bit Coolidge obsessed, so I do. There's nothing I don't. If you could stop me, I'll be very pleased because I love. He's a very interesting topic.
Have your socialist relatives started to see the error of their ways over time?
Well, what's funny is, so I'm one of three, and my brother and sister are right-leaning. In fact, my brother is even like, I mean, he's very, I mean, he's like anarchist libertarian. I mean, like yeah, so he's very persuasive. I mean, he changed my whole view on the Fed. Like, I initially thought this is, makes sense to control the money supply. He's like, no. Gave me some Murray Rothbard, gave me some stuff on the gold standard, cured me of that affliction right away. And I think we were talking about this earlier with Coolidge. One of the problems, I think, is that there's certain legacies of the progressive era. A century ago, 1913 was actually a very terrible year for liberty. We got the income tax, we got the Fed, we also had the direct election of senators, which is essentially gutted federalism. And those principles, Coolidge was not very good at understanding the dangers of the progressive impulses. And so while he started out as a mild progressive in his youth, as he put it, events changed him. I mean, for instance, he was passing all these, pushing for all these laws when he was in the Massachusetts, to state senate. Then he becomes governor and has to actually enforce them, and sees that these are unworkable. There are all these laws on the books, and no one's actually enforcing them. And if you pass too many laws, you can't actually deal with them. And so, for our friend over Thomas, who's a legislator, I mean, there are many things I imagine that you deal with that are laws that are basically unenforceable. And Coolidge's view is that, as he put it to his father, who was later elected to the Vermont lower house, that it's much more important to defeat bad bills than to just push laws in general. But yeah, my socialist relatives, my mother's number 2 in a teachers union. She's a lost cause, I'm afraid. And my father, I don't think has ever had a political instinct other than voting with me against Deval Patrick, who is the proto-Obama that David Axelrod was managing. His slogan was "Together we can" rather than "Yes we can." And yeah, so he apparently wants to run for president. So that's something to enjoy. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like you to talk about Coolidge's relationship, or more accurately, intense dislike for Hoover, and
yes,
the policies that he predicted Hoover was going to impose.
Yeah, this is very interesting because Coolidge was very much a party man, and so he very reluctantly criticized anyone. However, Hoover was the exception. And he said, for 6 years that man has given me unsolicited advice as Commerce Secretary. All of it has been bad. He referred to him dismissively as his wonder boy. His whole year-long, 500-word or 400 to 500-word post-presidential column can essentially be read as a criticism of, like, I wouldn't have done this as president. When he endorses Hoover only at the 11th hour when everyone else pushes him to. He thinks that when he ultimately decides against this. Many people wanted him to run in 1928. They thought, even in actually 1932, he dies in 33. And they wanted him to run. They were very much pushing him to run. Thomas Alva Edison was pushing him to run. Henry Ford was thinking of running himself, which I think would have been a disaster. But everyone was pushing Coolidge to run. And Coolidge's view, again, a deeply religious man, he thought he was being punished. His father had just died. His son had died previously while he was in the White House. I mean, to think that, we lived in a country where, that a president's son could be playing tennis, get a blood blister, it goes septic, and he dies, right? And now we're fighting for, a national right to health care. Everyone lives for forever, I guess. I don't know. But Coolidge was he thought God was telling him not to do this. And so while lots of people said, oh, you could run, it would be the end of this depression, he said it would be the beginning of mine. People wanted him to run to be president of Amherst College. He said it's easier to run Congress than a college faculty. So he very much had a sense of his own limits. And if you get a real sense of this in his autobiography, and I think that assessment of man understanding his own limits and when to ration himself, when to be politically involved, that's something that's totally lacking from a lot of politicians today. I mean, even those on the right. I mean, there's this idea that the president should be everything from national pothole filler to carrying what Johnny's learning in kindergarten. That expansive view of the president was something Coolidge was very opposed to. And I think it would have been nice to have Coolidge actually drive the death knell through progressivism, which he had started to kind of dismantle a lot of the Wilson policies. The campaign of 1920 was a return to normalcy, which is something I think we could very much use today. And it was very effective. It was very popular at kind of rolling back some of these, the progressives had effectively nationalized the railroads. They were doing all sorts of, trying to tinker with the wage rates. So I think it would have been nice to have him roll these things back, but he was also very clear that the appropriate response to our problems is not the federal government, it's local government. And this man who had gone door to door campaigning as a city councilman and worked his way up the ranks to be president of the United States, I think that's sort of a call to action for many of us to be more engaged in our own. No political figure is kind of going to save us. It's kind of not. So in any event, any other questions, Thomas or Tom?
Can you just expand on the last thing you just said? I was reading his autobiography.
Yes.
And in one part he says, an enormous amount of work has been done, but there's too much expectation of good out of the administration. He says, the government could and did stop the waste of the people's savings, but it could not restore them. That has to be done by the hard work and thrift of the people going forward.
Yes.
So, in light of a approaching $17 trillion national debt, how far do you think this country has gone, and what do you think it'll take to finally get us to a point of prosperity?
Right. Well, I mean, of course, we have all these entitlements, right, that eat up just a whole chunk of our budget immediately. And of course, we have to borrow to finance those things. And so Coolidge, what's interesting about Coolidge in his early life is he went with his father, who was a jack of all trades. One of those jobs was as a tax collector. And so young Coolidge went with the older John Calvin Coolidge and went door to door collecting taxes. And so he saw how painful it was for people in his hometown to actually pay the minimal taxes that they owed, and how much that came out of having to pay for their kids to go to school, how much it took out of them. And that idea never left him. So he never thought of taxes as other people's money. He always thought of it as the citizens, as you taking. And that idea has kind of disappeared, even among conservatives. I mean, you see people in the House of Representatives, for instance, on the Republican side saying, "Oh, it's only $200 million," right? I mean, this idea that government, we can continue going as long as we've gone, or and forever, just essentially borrowing and spending money. It might work so long as the dollar is the reserve currency for a time, but Coolidge thought that this was dangerous, and he quoted scripture on this: the idea that man has to earn his daily bread, and that the only way you can actually better yourself is to work. And his view, even as a progressive, he said this. The Republican Party, when he was talking about the Republican platform, he said, we're going to be dedicated to things like taking care of the elderly, taking care of the sick and the infirm, but the normal have to take care of themselves. And we've had a lot of the normal not taking care of themselves, depending on government benefits. And that's something that needs to change. And whether it happens because we have a financial panic in this crisis, or in this country, a more serious thing, which I think is probably inevitable. I mean, I look at California, and how Illinois. I mean, you guys seem to be racing us to oblivion. I mean, it's comical. Maybe it'll be good because you'll go off the cliff first and you'll get rebuilt or something. I don't know, but yeah, yes, sir, in the back.
California's got oil. How old are you?
24.
I'm very impressed.
Oh, thank you.
Do you get invited to speak at college campuses?
I do. I have. So I caused a lot of trouble. Part of the reason I got to the Wall Street Journal was I ran a website, a free speech website, that got me into a lot of trouble, and I translated all these writings that a pro-Hamas Hezbollah speaker, he was saying one thing to West Side Jewish homes about how much he loved peace and everything, and then in the Hezbollah newspaper saying how much he hated the Jews, which there was sort of a disconnect, so all I needed to do was translate it, and so I ended up getting all these awards, and that I did a lot of work in computer science. I thought that was going to be my career, to be a computer science geek. Then people kept paying me and kept insisting that I write things. So, it seemed easier than writing code all day.
I get this message, and their minds are still pliable, but it's
so dominant in the left. And the only thing I ever knew about Calvin Coolidge, is he the one that said, I do not choose to run?
That's right. Yeah, he gave out slips of paper to all
The only thing I
the...
ever heard about Calvin Coolidge was from Floyd the Barber, and I thought, because he's an idiot, he must be, I knew nothing about this man.
Yeah, what's interesting about... So
this
is well, the thing that shocks me, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, there's so much of how the political left controls our minds, as well as our... And there's so much stuff that there's so many presidents, there's so much parts of American history that I wish I knew more about. And the books exist, like they're in the library, even on Google Books now. You can find them, you could read them, you could educate yourself. But you go to my mother's a history teacher, and she, you go and you look at the history books, and it's all about how this ethnic group was discriminated against in the past, and therefore we need to atone for this or that. And then basically people are made to be aliens in their own country. And that needs to change. I think the guy I would say that's actually very good at getting young people involved and engaged is probably my friend James O'Keefe, who brought down Acorn and others. And he actually had shared the same agent, so I recommend his book, which is quite good too. So, but yes, Hasmin.
Speaking on what this man said, my friend told me one way to get to these young Bible minds is to get the books in the libraries. Wherever you are, and I just made a phone call to our library in Wilmette, is to get them to buy these books as part of their collection. Don't let them say, oh, we get it from another library. No, I want it in our collection. And then they'll say, well, by this standard, I looked on Amazon and there's no review of this book. And so I said, I will read it, I will write it, and I'll write one for the library too. So if you can be active in that way, in getting Charlton's book, call your local library, say, this is a new book, and they're all about getting new books. They will look forward. I asked for a book in 2011. They were like, oh, that's old. I said, it was a year and a half ago. And it was a conservative book.
Yeah, I mean,
so
one thing I would say
and
is that you'd be surprised it has, I read 4 Thomas Sowell books before I even realized he was black, which is kind of funny. But you'd be surprised, your local library, I was just, you'd be surprised, I guess people don't go to libraries anymore. I would encourage your, family members to go there and be very aware. My wife has a 16-year-old cousin who's come from Indonesia, and so I've got her reading basic economics and all these other. She only knows American culture from CSI and from Twitter and Instagram and all this stuff. So it's been kind of a struggle, but I think there is hope. But I always say despair is the ultimate sin because it assumes that you can't actually save your situation. And I intend to live a long life, so I don't want to be despairing just yet. But yes, you, sir.
Can you preview your Obama book with your theme?
Oh, I would love to.
I wonder if this was your working title. You said earlier, Obama fake, change for the sake of change.
Yes.
So I take your Obama book might be a little
critical,
less complimentary. Can you give us a quick
Well, I'm fascinated by Obama, and I understand that you're all Illinoisians. Is that how you say it? Illinoisians? I don't know. Yeah. So I'm really interested in Obama because both Coolidge and Obama are products of their education, which of course is the problem. And I knew when I was a scholarship student at a liberal prep school. I know Obama's type. I went to school with them. They're sort of this to the manner born mentality. And so what I did is, my wife, by providence or by happenstance, was born in Indonesia, came to America when she was 12. So I went over to Indonesia with her, went to all the same places Obama, went to school and so forth, learned all about his mother's involvement with the Ford Foundation. And there'll be a really interesting story that I've timed for President Obama's birthday, which is in early August, which I'm working on right now. But the story I did today, for instance, is about his half-brother, Malik Obama. There's a picture of him with Gaddafi when he was much younger, and I published that today. And that's been I heard it was on Fox earlier today. And so what I like to do is, with Obama's fascinating to me because in my view, he's a fraud. And he's a fraud in many senses. There's so much about his life that he has told, like, telling people at the Democratic National Convention that he was there when his mother died. Not true. Just like basic factual things that would be obvious to anyone. And so, I was the one who found the Derek Bell tape, the one of him hugging him, gave it to Andrew Breitbart, the late Andrew Breitbart. And so I was interested in using my computer science skills, basically a forensic, to get everything about Obama. So I went to Punahou in Hawaii, which is, fortunately, the president has gone to some really nice weather schools, Occidental and California. I was in Chicago last year for 14 days, pulling all this stuff from the Chicago Defender of him when he was sort of a more black figure. And later this afternoon, I'm going to go either today or maybe tomorrow to the Alice Palmer archives. So I'm very interested in doing kind of archival research, learning the most about Obama as possible. And the story I want to tell about Obama is sort of how is this possible? How is this guy, presented himself? And there are all these kind of, you realize on the right, there are actually very few investigative journalists. There are actually very few people. Like a lot of what we do on the right is we just complain about the left. Well, they hate us and our way of life, and they just as soon, we all, disappear. And they're counting on a lot of us just to get too old and become politically useless anyways. That's what they say. You can read their message boards, and that's their game plan, is to basically import a new, they don't like the citizenry they have, so they want to import a new citizenry, which is a lot of what this immigration fight is about, in my view. And they have a much longer view. And so like next week, for instance, I'm going to be publishing, I found David Axelrod's father, Joseph Axelrod's Communist Party membership in 1936, and I'm going to publish that. So the idea is we can use the net now with Drudge and with others to actually get our ideas to a larger audience, because they control the means of distribution of information right now. So the trick will be first and foremost to defeating that kind of nexus, to sort of create our own institutions. And it'll be a long fight, but the Obama book I think it'll be a lot of fun. I mean, I've been working on it for quite some time. I was actually at the 2004 convention where Obama was giving the speech, actually as a liberal, and I was like, hey, what has Obama done? Like, we're all liberals. Like, what has he done that like we should be really excited about? And they're like, oh, well, he's black. And I'm like, okay. Like maybe my generation, like I never got the memo that I was supposed to feel like guilty for being, white or for whatever. Like it just sort of happened. Like I didn't choose it, just as he didn't choose being black. And that idea, there are a lot of people who are becoming increasingly frustrated with him. Certainly in my generation, there are a lot of people who voted for Obama that are now unemployed, and they're really angry. So maybe things will change. Yes?
Suggestion and a question. Suggestion is when you research Obama, you look into Michelle Robinson's background and her position as part of the Chicago black royalty.
Yeah, well, they're grooming her. My understanding is they're grooming her to run against Mark Kirk in 2016. That's the thing that's gotten back to me. And if you saw that I published an article she wrote that was over the summer about how racist the Socratic method is, which was on Fox and elsewhere, which is just hilarious. I mean, like, I thought it was a joke, but apparently it was serious. But yeah, there's all sorts of stuff, and certainly her experience working in Chicago, or University of Chicago as sort of a community service rep. All that period is very interesting. She went to school with the Jackson daughters. She knew Jesse Jackson Jr. quite well. But anyone who has any information, you can find me on Twitter or you can reach me afterwards. But I'd love. There's all sorts of stuff on Obama that's really interesting, and I'm always looking for people in Chicago to do research. And so if you have anyone who I could pay to do some research, I'd happily employ them. So
you pay? Wait a minute.
I do. Oh, I didn't pay you. Yeah, you didn't want money. I think, if I remember correctly. He helped me on a great project, which we can't ever talk about, but it was very amazing. And you saw it on television.
Here's the question, if I could.
Yeah, sir. It's Chuck C. Johnson at Twitter. Yeah.
Here's the question I was
Yes.
going to ask. What do you think Coolidge would have said, and what do you say about the NSA eavesdropping?
So I'm of mixed minds about this. This is one of those things where I'm kind of all over the place on. I haven't made up my opinion. First because I don't think I have enough information. I think part of the reason the NSA did what it did is that we have brought into this country people who are hostile to this country. We brought in on purpose. We brought in the Chechens. We brought on a whole bunch of Islamist types into this country. I mean, I had friends who went to school with the younger Tsarnaev brother. This is not. I'm from Boston. Like, my first kiss was across the street from where they blew the place up. My sister was there an hour earlier. You know what I mean? Like, it's not an idol. So what happens is we bring in these people, they chatter amongst themselves, and so we justify the NSA having that program. And so, like, what happened was that after 9/11, we passed all these. I'm doing a short book on the IRS Tea Party scandal, but it's related because Booz Allen Hamilton, which is the same contractor, they control a lot of the data mining operations that the government does. And my understanding is that basically they got all this information, and so from this information they were doing all sorts of data mining of it, looking for word associations, looking for statistical, links between bomb and jihad or whatever, and then monitoring that email address. In fact, the Tsarnaev brothers, my understanding is that they actually communicated with the terrorist cell in London through Twitter. You know, they were doing the follow back thing, and that, to me, you know, from Snowden's perspective, I understand why Snowden left the country. I mean, there are a lot of whistleblowers. There's a woman here in Chicago, Annabelle Malongo, who exposed the Save a Life Foundation, and she recorded her boss, Carol Spizzerizi, you know, this corrupt woman who was running this fraudulent charity for CPR, and they put her in jail for 20 months. You know, this Cameroonian immigrant who was trying to be a whistleblower. So, you know, and my friend James O'Keefe has been targeted by the FBI. You know, this is not, I can understand Snowden's perspective. At the same time, I think that going to Glenn Greenwald, who has a history of anti-Americanism, is not the appropriate venue. I mean, if he'd given it to, I mean, maybe it's selfish to say this, but if he'd given it to me, I would have published the same stuff, because I think people have a right to know it. But I think the manner in which he's gone about it, you know, you don't flee to, you know, to Putin's Russia if you're interested in civil liberties.
You stay where they can deport you.
Yeah, maybe, but maybe you go to non-extradition countries. There are other non-extradition countries other than Russia, right? I mean, yeah, he tried South America. He's tried. I mean, I understand his perspective, and if I were in, you know, I appreciate his bravery, you know, but at the same time, I think I hope that there would have been another way to actually get that information out than the manner in which he did it.
Like the New York Times.
Well, like for instance, doing what WikiLeaks did, publishing it all there, or publishing it. Yeah. I mean, fair enough. I mean, I'm not sure what I think on this, but at the same time, I'm very critical of how you go about exposing the secrets. I think the message is important. Everyone needs to hear it, but so is the manner in which you get the message out. Because there are a lot of these people now asking the serious question of whether or not, you know, he was working with the Russians. And to me, that's, you know, members of Congress are asking that question. And to me, that's a total distraction, and they're trying to distract from the real issue of the NSA surveilling all these people. And believe me, I've had journalist friends of mine who've had their phones bugged, so it's a real serious, it's a serious issue. But yeah.
Yeah, as a